The United States entered the First World War in April 1917. Although initially the influence was limited, this changed over time. Already in spring 1918, all major powers were drawing conclusions from the buildup of US forces in Europe, but more on this later. In total, around 3,758,000 men were raised by the United States in World War I. Yet not all of them were shipped to Europe or reached it before the war ended. The number grew steadily from May 1917 to November 1918, as you can see here. This is also due to the fact that on average a soldier was trained for 6 months. In 1917 less than 200,000 US troops were brought to Europe, yet in July 1918 it was more than 1 million men, and by the end of the war the number had reached 2 million men. Although these numbers are a bit misleading because the actual combat strength gives a clearer indication. By March 1918 more than 329,000 men had arrived, but around half that number, 162,000 men, were combat strength. At the end of the war, more than 2 million men had arrived in Europe, and again, about half that number made up the actual combat strength. Now before we look at the length of the front lines held by the different nations on the Western Front, some background information about the independent command of the American Expeditionary Force. The French and the British wanted to use US troops to fill up their depleted divisions. Yet the US leadership opposed this idea, and the commander of the American Expeditionary Force was instructed by the Secretary of War that the US forces are a separate and distinct component of the combined forces. One of the strategic reasons for this was that Wilson depended on having a strong, visible and independent American presence on the battlefield when the Allies won the war. The United States needed to play a major role in fighting, Wilson believed, to guarantee him a prominent voice in fashioning the peace, which after all was one of the primary reasons the president had led the nation into war. Now an important aspect is of course how much were US troops involved in warfare. Luckily we have some very interesting numbers here, namely the miles of the Western Front occupied by US, British, French, which includes Italian and Portuguese, and Belgian forces. As you can clearly see, the total front line also changed over the time. Now in the end of August 1918 the US forces started to hold more miles than the British, and besides the end of September continued to hold more, reaching the maximum number on October 10, 1918. Thus the US influence on the battlefield was growing steadily, or as the naval historian H.B. Wilmer put it, in any event, the war ended before the American military emerged from a position of last among equals, though the reality of American national power and the potential of the United States in terms of future strength and preeminence was recognized by the countries with which it was a partner. The major influence of US troops on the war was clear to the powers in Europe in spring 1918. It caused the French to see that they would win the war after all, and thus stiffened their demands regarding a peace settlement. It caused the British War Cabinet to realize that the war must be won in 1918 before the Americans dominated the world. It caused the Germans to realize that they must relocate as many divisions as possible from the east to the west. Now let's move back to the United States and let's look at the number of soldiers from each state or territory. As you can see, New York provided the highest number of soldiers. This is due to the fact that in 1910 and 1920 New York had the largest population of any US state. This is quite different nowadays, since California is number 1 in that regard, and New York is third with about 50% of the population of California. This is just one of the many examples where contemporary common knowledge can be misleading when applied to history. Another example in the era of World War II would be to take the modern German car industry as a metric for German automotive industry in the 1930s, because back then Germany was clearly undermotorized, something I discuss in one of my Eastern Front videos. Now back to the map, you might wonder why the Philippines show up here. Well, back then, the Philippines were a US colony. Now since we already mentioned the Germans, let's move back to a position between the United States and Germany, the Atlantic. After all, German submarines were a major threat to shipping, and in 1916 the Allied losses to German submarines were extensive. And in 1917, the value almost tripled. Only in 1918 it went down significantly. Now the question is, how many US troops were lost due to submarine attacks? Well, in this regard, the German submarine force failed in inflicting any significant damage to the troop transport. The US Navy helped ensure that tens of millions of tons of supplies reached Europe. 2 million US troops safely crossed the Atlantic. Only 637 were lost to German submarines. 431 soldiers and Coast Guard men were killed, and 890 wounded in carrying out this vital duty. This was due to switching to a convoy system, more escorts and mining large areas that prevented submarines from entering the Atlantic. And it should be noted that about half of the US troops were transported to British ports, and most of these men were shipped by the British to Europe. Additionally, more than half of all the troop ships that brought the American Expeditionary Force to Europe were provided with British escorts. As you can see, numbers can provide an interesting perspective on certain aspects in history that can be quite revealing, although the context should always be understood, especially when comparisons to contemporary issues are drawn, since the shift in population, industry and power dynamics that occurred since the First World War were quite extensive, not only in the world, but also within the United States. Special thanks to the US WW1 Centennial Commission for helping me with data for this video. Be sure to check out their pages linked in the description, where you can also find links to the sources used in this video. If you want to learn more about World War I, check out this video about World War I artillery combat, or maybe this video on the Sturmpanzerwagen A7V, the first German tank. Thank you for watching and see you next time.